Okay, I'm starting a new series today. This is on undesigned coincidences and external confirmations in real contemporary history, or modern history. I'm often asked, do you have examples of undesigned coincidences in history outside of the Gospels? And I've tried to respond to that. Check my videos on Bloody Sunday and on Dirk Bogart's testimony about visiting one of the Holocaust death camps. And so I have done that. Now I'm going to do more. This is based upon the testimony in the 1948 Hiss versus Chambers hearings in Congress. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background in this first video. You can look it up, get more background. Whittaker Chambers, under a variety of names, was a spy. He was a communist spy in the 1930s, and he was very close friends with Alger Hiss. Hiss was highly placed in the United States government and much better looking than Chambers, as it happens, and just had a lot of influential friends and so forth. And according to Chambers, Hiss was also a spy, and they were close friends and were working together in the 1930s before Chambers changed his mind, left not only the spying activity, but also the Communist Party altogether in the late 1930s. Now, he tried to act as a whistleblower in 1939 with the United States government, but they weren't interested. In 1948, a House committee of the United States House of Representatives was much more interested and began to take testimony from Chambers. In that testimony, he named various names, and one of them was someone that he said he had known well as a fellow spy, and that was Alger Hiss. This came as a big shock to the people who heard it because of Hiss's prominent position as friendships and so forth with various people. So what the committee began to do was to call in Chambers to ask him all kinds of stuff about his friendship with Hiss, and then send him away, call in Hiss, and get him to testify about himself, his life, and so forth. At first, Hiss insisted that he had never known Chambers at all. This was based on photographs of Chambers, and he just denied any knowledge of him at all. And some of our most interesting, most exciting examples come from that phase of the testimony where it was very clear that they had known one another, and very clear that they had known one another well. Later, they confronted Hiss and Chambers in person. Hiss still was hesitant, and then eventually admitted to having known Chambers, but only, he claimed, slightly, having known him as a down and out to whom he loaned an apartment temporarily, not a good friend, and later said he gave him a car, which was kind of strange. If he didn't like him and they weren't close at all, why did he give him a car? And the whole matter of the car becomes one of the most fascinating pieces of external corroboration of Chambers' testimony. So I'm going to take several of these undesigned coincidences from the time when Hiss was still insisting that he hadn't known Chambers at all, and Chambers was insisting that they had been close friends. The committee always got the testimony from Chambers first. So whatever Hiss said in his testimony, even if in some elaborate way Chambers could have gotten someone to report it to him, and they tried to avoid that, it wouldn't have mattered, because he was testifying on these specific things first, and then Hiss was. So the dependency issues here are fascinating. I've said before, I want to reiterate here, the more the alleged witnesses are kept separate, the more similar their testimony can be while still counting as an undesigned coincidence. So these are mostly not going to take the form of cause and effect. Okay, the cause and effect form is especially interesting when we have no, information that these witnesses were definitely kept separate from knowing what each other had attested. In this case, what it's going to be is they're agreeing on the same content, though with variations of detail, and that will still be there. These variations of detail, more detail or different detail that one person or the other person gives. And then the overarching question or hypothesis that we're trying to evaluate is Chambers and Hiss were good friends. As I've spoken of before, what we're looking for is independence on the negation. Okay, so, or even negative dependence, but no positive dependence on the negation. So if Hiss and Chambers were not friends, if they had not known one another, would they both be giving this agreeing testimony? We have to bear in mind that there was no social media. There was no such thing as Googling somebody. People had a lot more privacy in 1948. In fact, I was born in 1965, and right up through the 1980s, people had a lot more privacy. Unless you were rich and famous and gave interviews to, newspapers or something, or had paparazzi following you around, people who were complete strangers to you didn't tend to know, what hobbies you had as a child, what hobbies you have currently, unless they were involved with you on that given hobby. What your first dog's name was, or whatever, okay? And that's why people, even of my generation, and I'm a lot younger than Hiss and Chambers, were concerned and still are concerned somewhat at the loss of privacy through the internet and through social media. If you are not of my generation or older, you need to try to get into that mindset that these kinds of things are not the kinds of things that just anybody could just go look up about Alger Hiss. It was very difficult. So today I'm going to talk about the prothonotary warbler, a bird, and I'm going to try to find a picture of the warbler, put it as the thumbnail for today. And so during this time, when Hiss was still insisting that he hadn't known Chambers at all, not even under another name or whatever, there was testimony from the two of them in separate closed-door meetings of the committee about this bird. All right, so I'm going to read first a little snippet from the testimony of Chambers. This is from the book Witness. And if you're interested in this kind of thing at all, if you're interested in history, Cold War history, testimony, Christianity, because Chambers became a Quaker, which he thought of as Christian, though I believe he was baptized in the Episcopalian Church. And there's a lot about religion, communism, and all that stuff. So if you're interested in that at all, definitely get this book. All right, so this is a little snippet of testimony. And the names I'm giving, Mr. So-and-so, etc., are congressmen who are questioning Chambers. Mr. Mandel, did Mr. Hiss have any hobbies? Mr. Chambers, yes, he did. They both had the same hobby. He's referring here to Hiss and his wife, Priscilla. Amateur ornithologists, bird observers. They used to get up early in the morning and go to Glen Echo, out the canal, to observe birds. I recall once they saw, to their great excitement, a prothonotary warbler. Mr. McDowell, a very rare specimen? Mr. Chambers, I never saw one. I am also fond of birds. All right, so there's the testimony of Chambers that Hiss got up early in the morning when they were friends and would go do bird watching, and that he came back one day, he was really excited because he'd seen this rare bird, a prothonotary warbler. Notice the details. They would go out to Glen Echo, out the canal. I'm not familiar with that geography, but okay. So now I'm going to read a snippet about Hiss's testimony. The narrator here is Chambers. But the clinching point of this part of the testimony came when Richard Nixon questioned Hiss about his interest in ornithology. At that point, Congressman McDowell asked, "Did you ever see a prothonotary warbler?" Mr. Hiss, "I have, right here on the Potomac. Do you know the place?" Mr. Nixon, "Have you ever seen one?" Mr. Hiss, "Did you see it in the same place?" Speaking to McDowell, I would say, or Nixon. Mr. McDowell, "I saw one in Arlington." Mr. Hiss, "They come back and nest in those swamps. Beautiful yellowhead, a gorgeous bird." All right. Now, if you've ever seen the movie The Big Year, which I've only seen recently, you know how passionate bird watchers can be, and even to some extent competitive, that they want to see a bird, that nobody else has seen or that few other people have seen. Now, McDowell, we're going to learn here, was a bird watcher. So McDowell slips in the question, after they've established that Hiss is into bird watching, which in itself is a confirmation of Chambers' testimony, but he just slips in the question, "Did you ever see a prothonotary warbler?" Hiss, I think understandably, assumes that McDowell has seen one. So he wants to, question him on that. He guesses he's seen one. Do you know that place? Did you see it in the same place? So they're kind of talking over each other, right? And so he's speaking, Hiss, to McDowell as one bird watcher to another. And he gets enthusiastic. He gets excited. And I would say unsuspecting that in doing this, he's confirming anything that Chambers said. Because for McDowell to ask, "Did you see a prothonotary warbler? Have you ever seen a prothonotary warbler?" It doesn't sound like he's asking him to agree or disagree with something specific they've been told. It sounds like he's bringing up something he himself is interested in as a fellow bird watcher. Even to name the word prothonotary warbler, a non-bird watcher probably would not have even heard of that. Okay? Again, it's not the information age. So Hiss immediately confirms that. Let me point out, if Hiss had had any inkling of what Chambers had testified, remember, he's still trying to say they didn't know each other at all. Okay? His motive, the thing that would have served that purpose would be to deny it. To say, "Oh, no, I wish I had. Have you?" Right? But he doesn't. He immediately says, "I have, right here on the Potomac." Okay, so it's got exactly the right kind of independence or even negative dependence that if Hiss had heard of Chambers' testimony, which had already been given, he would have had a motive to deny it, okay, and to say he hadn't in order to continue to maintain that they didn't know each other. He still would have had to explain how Chambers knew that he was an ornithologist. But, okay, so remember, in the absence of some kind of, magazine or something in which Alger Hiss discussed having seen a prothonotary warbler, it's going to be very hard for Chambers to know that about him if he did not personally know him. Hiss used to try, I was just reviewing this morning, to ask the committee to give him Chambers' testimony, which is pretty blatant because obviously they're not going to do that. They don't want to do that. And he would try to insinuate that they were feeding his testimony to Chambers until one day one of the congressmen kind of got annoyed and he said, "Look, Chambers is testifying before you. So, if you're confirming something he's saying, it's not because we're giving your testimony to him. And we're just trying to find out who's telling the truth and who's lying, because one of you has to be lying." Obviously, if one person says we were close friends, the other person said, "I don't know the guy at all," then one of them has to be lying. Now, later, Hiss changed his story, and we'll talk about that more when we get to some of the external confirmations and tried to say, oh, yeah, I kind of knew him as this down and out, but it would still be difficult to explain some of these, what I might call little intimate details that Chambers knew about him. I mean, you know, if you're just helping out some down and out, you don't even like the guy, you think nothing of him, are you going to come back and say, oh, I'm so excited I saw a prothonotary warbler today on one of the few rare occasions, you know, when you've known him? Seems pretty unlikely. Okay, so I'm going to read what Chambers comments about this. The point of passing importance was that about the prothonotary warbler, a bird little bigger than $50, whose name many people hesitate to pronounce, and which I have never seen. It was that beautiful bird, glimpsed in a moment of wonder one summer morning some 14 years before, that first clinched the committee's conviction that I must have known Alger Hiss. A mind might figure out, and many minds were soon avidly figuring out, how I might have known the answers to the other questions, but not the prothonotary warbler. The man who volunteered that information, the man who knew that fugitive detail, must have known Alger Hiss. Congressman McDowell grasped the meaning of that testimony before I did, and I believe before his colleagues. When I mentioned it, his eyes flew open, for he too was a bird watcher, and he had seen a prothonotary warbler. Okay, so I'll continue this. I may interrupt this series to give myself a break and do something a little easier at some point, but come back next time. Either it'll be that easier thing, or it will be my next in the series on undesigned coincidences between the testimony of Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. Thanks for watching the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.